The Chrono Core Countdown. Act 1, The Midnight Alarm. The neon skyline of Neo-Saitama bled through the shattered glass of the abandoned laboratory. Rain poured through the hole in the ceiling, splashing onto the cold concrete floor. Rin crouched behind a rusted server rack, her breathing shallow, erratic, and heavy. Her long, midnight black hair was soaked, clinging to the fabric of her tattered school uniform jacket. Her striking sapphire blue eyes, usually filled with a calm, quiet confidence, were wide with adrenaline. She looked down at her left wrist. Strapped to it was a bulky, metallic gauntlet, the Chrono Core. Its digital interface glowed with a harsh, unyielding crimson light. 9:58. The countdown numbers flickered, ticking backward with a soft, rhythmic beep that felt like a death knell. 9 minutes and 58 seconds. That was all the time she had left. If the timer hit 0, the unstable singularity matrix inside the core would detonate, leveling the entire district. A heavy, metallic thud echoed from the corridor outside, vibrating through the concrete floor. The screech of tearing metal followed, piercing the steady hum of the rain. They were here. Rin peeked around the edge of the rack. Entering the room was a terrifying marvel of rogue engineering, a Scavenger Mech. It stood over 8 feet tall, a grotesque fusion of hydraulic limbs, exposed wiring, and rusted armor plating. Instead of a face, it possessed a cluster of revolving red optical sensors that swept the room like a searchlight. In place of its right arm was a heavy, motorized rotary saw, spinning with a deafening whir that kicked up a spray of old dust and sparks. The red light of the mech's sensors swept over her hiding spot. It paused. The optical lenses clicked and zoomed. Target localized, a distorted, synthetic voice droned through the mech's external speakers. Initiating termination protocol. Act 2, The First Encounter. The rotary saw roared to life, a high-pitched scream that tore through the silence of the room. Rin didn't hesitate. She threw herself backward just as the massive blade sheared through the server rack, sending a violent cascade of sparks, molten metal, and severed wires into the air. She rolled to her feet, her boots skidding across the wet floor. Her hand flew to the hilt of the weapon sheathing her hip, the plasma edge. With a sharp flick of her wrist, the hilt ignited, extending into a brilliant, humming blade of pure blue energy that cast sharp shadows across her porcelain skin. 8:14. The countdown on her wrist flashed. Time was slipping away, and she couldn't afford to play defense. The Scavenger Mech lunged forward with surprising speed, its massive hydraulic legs driving it across the room. It swung its saw arm in a wide, horizontal arc meant to take Rin's head off. Rin ducked beneath the blade, the wind from the spinning metal whistling over her hair. She lunged forward, driving her plasma blade deep into the mech's exposed knee joint. The energy blade cut through the metal casing like butter, severing the hydraulic lines. Bright blue fluid sprayed across the floor, and the mech groaned, its massive weight collapsing onto one side. "One down," Rin muttered, her voice trembling slightly despite her tough exterior. But her relief was short-lived. From the dark hallway, more rhythmic thuds echoed. 2 more Scavenger Mechs stepped into the light, accompanied by a swarm of smaller, arachnid-like seeker drones that scattered across the walls and ceiling, their red eyes locked onto her. Act 3, Trapped and Outnumbered. 5:45. Rin's chest heaved as she backed up against the reinforced glass window overlooking the flooded city streets below. She was entirely cornered. The seeker drones attacked first, leaping from the ceiling with razor-sharp mandibles extended. Rin spun her blade in a defensive wheel, deflecting the first 2 drones, slicing them into smoking halves. But a third drone caught her off guard, grazing her left shoulder. The sharp metal tore through her uniform, leaving a shallow gash that burned with pain. She winced, dropping to one knee. The 2 remaining giant mechs advanced, their optical sensors glowing brighter as they prepared to crush her. Warning, chrono core instability rising, the gauntlet's automated voice chimed inside her ear. Time remaining, 4 minutes. I know. Shut up. Rin screamed at her own wrist. She looked at the reinforced glass behind her, then down at the flooded street 3 stories below. It was a reckless, stupid plan, the kind of plan she usually hated. But looking at the wall of steel closing in on her, she didn't have a choice. Gathering every ounce of strength left in her legs, Rin activated the chronocore's secondary function, a localized kinetic burst. A shockwave of blue energy erupted from her gauntlet, throwing the arachnid drones backward and staggering the giant mechs. Using the momentum, Rin turned, raised her plasma blade, and shattered the reinforced glass window, throwing herself outward into the empty, rainy night. Act 4, The Final Ascent. Falling through the air, Rin fired a magnetic grapple line from the underside of her gauntlet. The cable snapped taut, hooking onto a crane protruding from the roof of the adjacent building. She swung through the pouring rain, her body slamming hard against the emergency fire escape stairs of the opposite tower. She groaned, coughing as the impact knocked the wind from her lungs. She dragged herself up the metal stairs, checking her wrist. 1:30. 90 seconds. The crimson numbers were flashing violently now. When she reached the rooftop, she realized she hadn't escaped. Standing in the center of the helipad was the Alpha unit, a massive, sleek, black armored combat mech equipped with dual plasma rifles and heavy thrusters. It had anticipated her escape route. The core must be retrieved, the Alpha unit boomed, its voice resonating in Rin's chest. Your termination is mathematically absolute. I've always been bad at math, Rin spat, wiping a mixture of rain and blood from her cheek. She ignited her plasma blade one last time, though the blue energy flickered weakly, reflecting the low power of her systems. 0:45. The Alpha unit opened fire. Blue plasma bolts rained down across the rooftop, blowing chunks of concrete into the air. Rin sprinted through the explosion zone, dodging left and right, her black hair whipping wildly around her. A bolt struck the ground right next to her, the concussive force lifting her off her feet and throwing her onto the wet concrete. Her blade deactivated, clattering out of her reach. Act V, 0 hour. 0:15. The Alpha unit walked forward, its heavy footsteps echoing over the sound of the thunder. It stood over her, raising its massive metal foot to crush her chest. Rin looked at her flashing gauntlet. 15 seconds. She couldn't reach her sword. She couldn't run. With her remaining right hand, she reached out and grabbed her own sword hilt from the ground, but instead of turning it on, she jammed the hilt directly into the exposed exhaust port of the chrono core on her left wrist. She forced her energy source to overload the gauntlet's internal battery. 0:05. Manual override accepted, the gauntlet whispered. Discharging singularity matrix. Rin screamed as a massive wave of blinding white electrical energy surged out of her gauntlet, traveling up her arms and exploding outward in a massive dome of raw power. The Alpha unit froze, its internal electronics frying instantly under the massive EMP blast. Sparks erupted from its joints, its red optical sensor flickering violently before going completely dark. The massive robot collapsed sideways, crashing onto the rooftop like a fallen monument of scrap metal. Midnight. The timer hit 0. The flashing stopped. The crimson light turned a calm, steady green. System stable. Hazard averted. Rin collapsed backward onto the wet helipad, her muscles aching and her uniform ruined. The rain continued to fall, washing the soot and grime from her face. She looked up at the clearing night sky as the clouds began to part, revealing a brilliant blanket of stars. She let out a long, exhausted laugh, closing her sapphire eyes as she finally allowed herself to rest.